This video is brought to you by BTI Institute, a New Jersey leader in certification-based management training.
All right, so I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's Agile discussion group. And tonight's topic is let's discuss Kanban. And we're really fortunate to have Nitin here because Nitin is a certified Kanban specialist. I don't know the actual title. I'm sure we're going to get into that. And I personally have been pretty much working with Kanban teams, using Scrum, but never really a formal Kanban team until just this year. So we figured it's an interesting topic because a lot of people have a lot of misunderstandings about it. So let's get a little bit about me and Nitin. So, I've been around the Agile community for probably around 15 years. And right now I'm working at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And I have to say that my views here are personal. And anything I say do not reflect the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the Federal Reserve System, or the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. And with that, Nitin, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Bob. And just like Bob, I am an Agile enthusiast. We both share a string of letters after our name. We've got some great stories amongst us. I have worked as a Scrum Master, as a product owner. I have worked with teams that have scaled across different industries, and I've seen hyper-productive teams to teams that have tanked as well. So if you've been with us before, we are two palindromes, two perspectives, one philosophy. This works. So we do have an agenda. So we'll talk a little bit about lean software development and how it kind of weaves into Kanban as well. What exactly is Kanban? Some of us might have familiarity of it. Some of us are new to it. When should we use it? There are a multitude of flavors under agility. Although Scrum remains to be in the lead, people often wonder, should I use Scrum? Should I use Kanban? Is there a hybrid approach? We'll get into that. And more formally so, we will bring out 4 Kanban practices that we think are essential to do this well. Metrics drive behavior, and certainly we're going to talk about some things over there with throughput, velocity, cycle time, and at the end of which we'll have some resources, be it books or any formal training that might stir your interest. We'll bring that forth. So let's get into lean software development. Bob, tell us more.
Sure. Anybody that's been in the Agile community is probably familiar with the book by the Poppindex, Lean Software Development. And what it did is it actually pulled in lean processes and it kind of brought it together with Agile practices. And what I found interesting is when people often refer to Agile, they often refer to Lean Agile. And so those two words go hand in hand. And even recently in the Scrum Guide actually recognized that Lean, that Scrum is built on top of Lean as well. So Lean is definitely here. We can't ignore it. And there's some main principles. And again, probably Nitin and I could probably spend a whole hour talking about Lean, but we with this, we just wanted to, talk about the main things. And these bullets on the left, I'm going to get into a little bit more detail, but in essence, it's pretty much, it's common sense. You identify value, you look at what you want to do, where the value is, then basically you create a process or a way of actually making the work flow by the team. And then in Lean, you actually establish a pull system. And we're going to get into that with Kanban, where Kanban is really great, where people can look at the items that need to get done next and they can pull it. Nobody's like pushing it on people. Nobody's assigning. And also working with Agile teams, and you're always talking about continuous improvement. You're always looking at how do we do things better the next time. And so pretty much this is all in essence driving to meet customer needs. So then when we dive a little bit deeper into these different types of these areas in Lean, there's all different types of waste that can occur. A lot of time, a software developer, if we want to talk about software, is they might have a question, right? And they're waiting. They're basically, think about it. Somebody's head's really into it. They're really flying really fast. All of a sudden they need an answer. And guess what? they can't get that answer. It takes an hour, it takes 4 hours, it takes a day. So now what's going to end up happening is, and John, could you mute when you hear noise like that? And so basically what ends up happening is the person that's waiting for that answer has to do something else because they don't want to sit there waiting. So now you're doing context switching, which is more waste because now you have to take somebody that was doing something and now they have to start doing something else. And amplify learning. It's all about getting that feedback. And your experience working with agile teams, that's really what it's all about. The whole thing about the empirical process, inspect and adapt. And basically the other thing is doing iterations. And that means you're not doing it all at once, like the typical waterfall project where pretty much you don't show anybody anything for 6 months or a year. With Kanban, with Scrum, it's all about giving little bits of pieces and getting that feedback so you can move on and basically make corrections along the way. And this area here, deciding as late as possible, this is really exciting because the later you make the decision, the better off you are, because the more you wait, the more information you have to make the right decision. That's why it talks about the last possible moment. And then delivering as fast as possible, polling systems, looking at what the cost of delay is. Like when you have people sitting idle and not doing anything, there's used costs there. And the whole idea of Kanban is being able to pull work, as far as, what the team can do next. Then on the right side here, we have empowering the team. It's really interesting. Whenever I talk about lean, I immediately think about agile and Scrum because that's all about self-management, having the right skills on a team, having leaders that empower members, having leaders that teach members, having leadership that ends up being mentors. They're not like the bosses that say, you do this and you do that. Building quality in. That's what it's really all about, because the higher quality you have, the less time you're going to be wasting on fixing defects. Building testing in. It's looking at that whole idea of systems thinking, looking at the entire system. These are all parts of lean software development that we're living with. And often what that I find is a lot of people don't realize like where the origins are and where it comes from. And so now, after kind of giving an overview of lean, and you can look at, look at different definitions of Kanban. Basically, this one here says a strategy for optimizing flow of value through a process that uses a visual, work in progress, limited pull system. All right. And so pretty much that sums it all up. But unfortunately, I think a lot of people think if they're doing Scrum and they have a Kanban board, they're actually doing Kanban. But really, they're visualizing their workflow using Kanban, but there's a lot more to Kanban that you're going to be finding out. And so Nitin, would you like to share about when we should use Kanban?
Yeah, this is very interesting. So Bob and I have talked extensively about Scrum in the past. We won't go about defining it. So just some conventional thinking here. When should we use Kanban? And we've used Lean Coffee also as a quick example. And we use Kanban when we have more of a flow-based model. You have something going from point A to point B to point C to point D that is clearly well-defined, right? And visualization is the key. You need to be able to reflect the work, be able to poke holes at it, and then that gives you the ability to kind of pivot or see what has to be done. There are people anecdotally that have stories where you had Japanese consultants come in back in the day and look at software development teams, and they tapped on the computer monitors to say, problem in box, we need to get it up on the board or somewhere else. It's almost like the PC was hiding something and they weren't as accustomed to that in what they were doing. Scrum, I would say, use a little bit more when you do need a cadence or you have a cadence. Hey, we need a checkpoint for sure every 1 to 4 weeks. And a variance is welcome. We talk about customer feedback because that shortens the feedback loop as well. And then again, you can pivot. In traditional Kanban, if you talk about variances and the ways that Bob was talking about, people might be a little concerned. And here's the other interesting thing. Customer feedback influences what's next. This is very key when it comes to your sprint reviews or when you have some sort of demonstrations and get feedback over there. Now, again, this is an oversimplification, but these are just a few things to keep in mind to when you could use Kanban and when you could use Scrum.
And to add to what Nitin said, we basically we recognize two agile processes. We recognize Scrum and we recognize Kanban. Actually, they're both agile frameworks. And what we do is we actually develop the criteria where basically it's like a questionnaire where we ask the team the type of work that they're doing. And basically that would provide the guidance as far as whether they would be a Scrum team or they would be best suited for a Kanban team. And what we do also is we remind people that they think, oh, for Kanban, it's going to be a lot easier. And I will be the first to tell you that it's not. I think it's a really amazing framework and you can really deliver value very quickly with it, but it's not easier than Scrum. So if you're thinking, oh, I want to do something easy, don't just say, oh, I'm going to do Kanban now, because you really have to think about it. And we're hoping you're going to get out of this session so that you can start asking more questions.
So there's also some unconventional thinking here. What if we use Kanban with Scrum teams? And if we were to do it as how it's being laid out or how we're going to talk about it, how do we go about it? Now, we're not talking about Scrum bound. This is something that's emerged over the years by some practitioners. And as Bob said, just because you have some sort of a visualization of a Kanban board with swim lanes doesn't mean you're doing Scrumban or you're doing Kanban, right? It kind of gets a little mishmashed over there. All Scrum says is visualize the work. And I have also worked with teams that have not used a Kanban board and they've actually been hyper productive, meaning they've taken a lot more and they've delivered it bug-free sprint over sprint and done some amazing work over there. So let's get into the next slide. And this is about the 4 Kanban practices we wanted to focus on. Again, this is coming from the Kanban guide for Scrum teams. We've talked about it, and certainly visualization of the workflow, limiting your work in progress or WIP, active management of WIP, and then the inspect and adapt of the team's definition of workflow. There's some subtleties here, which we'll get into as we go ahead. If you're working with teams who are saying, hey, we are doing Kanban, I would go back tomorrow and see if these 4 things are out there. If they're not, certainly it's a journey of evolution. They might be heading there. And let's just see if they want to optimize Kanban or take up a challenge with these categories. So let's get into these. Bob, tell us about visualization.
Sure. My experience is like as you probably know by now, I'm a Jira fan. And I really like how you can do Scrum and visualize the workflow. And because basically you can start seeing, what everybody's doing. But normally when you do Scrum, you have to do in progress and done. And pretty much then you break down the subtasks with all the details that you're doing. And what's really cool about Kanban is when you set up a Kanban team, you actually have a meeting with the team and you talk about how do we do our work? And basically the team will get on a whiteboard and they'll start actually drawing, okay, we do this first, we'll do design, we'll then do coding, then we might need to review security, and basically you start creating headers for that, and that becomes columns on your Kanban board. So your Kanban board will look totally different than to do in progress and done. It'll actually show the different columns as far as where the work is. And the real power of that is you can start seeing what's slowing you down. Like you might see a lot of things going on in one particular column, and then you can take a step back and ask, like, what's going on here? What can we change? What can we make better? And then there's basically, you can actually do metrics where you can look at how much time it's taking to move from column to column. So that's really the powerful thing, where you can see what's going on. And you don't use those subtasks to identify those individual items. In essence, on Kanban, those are the items that are flowing through, and the columns are actually representing the different subtasks that the teams are doing. Nitin, did you have anything you want to add to that?
Thanks, Bob. It's very interesting. I did want to call out, when you come to Kanban practices, you can certainly be independent of Scrum, but if you were to do it, you could actually pull up your boards right at your daily Scrum or huddle to see how things are progressing. And also, when you get to visualizations, there could be some workflows that are outside of the Scrum team. Now, certainly there's an enterprise, there might be a portfolio, there might be things trickling down, and you could have swim lanes for those things, and the Scrum team is not a part of that. And also something beyond the Scrum team further down the cycle, let's say when you get into release, I mean, ideally you want to have some good engineering practices with continuous integration, continuous deployment. But what if there's another customer feedback cycle, or there are other things that happen with the market condition? You could have swim lanes for that as well. So the visualization could be much broader than just your immediate team. That's something to keep in mind.
And so let's take a break here. Is there any questions so far? Is this making sense? Should Nitin and I change? Because normally when we have these ADGs, right after the first slide, people are going, what about that? What about this? So is this resonating with you? Is there anything, anybody have any questions about what we're talking about?
Kim had a good question in the chat that just popped up. Does Kanban have any concept of time boxes? It's interesting. Kanban doesn't necessarily have a time box, but some of the metrics emerge, which we'll get into. So certainly when you go from point A to point B, how much time did you spend there? How many days were there? That gets into a cycle time. Throughput is another interesting thing. How much work did we complete at a certain junction and what that is? But there isn't any forced time box per se for some of the practices that we've listed out here. Any other questions or quick comments?
Bob, Nitin, can you put the presentation into full screen mode?
Sure. Okay. I just got this huge bar on top. Let's see if I move that.
So I actually thought that one of the benefits was that you were not time boxed with Kanban, right? It's like a production support area might be a good group, right? You have a prioritized list. You start the first one, you work until you're done, you move on to the next one. That would be the typical Kanban flow. But that's not that's not how I took away from the conversation so far. Are you looking at it from a different perspective?
No, I agree. And that's a great example, Dan. So we don't necessarily know when things will finish up in production support. You know, we might get a sense of like the severity, the level of support, and the escalation, but people still have to kind of figure out what's going on. And, you know, that time could be different. So this would work really well with production support teams. And I often recommend that and say, hey, don't do Scrum for production support related things. Use Kanban instead. So great call out.
Nitin, it's Larry. Just slightly different, but you triggered the question. Is there a hierarchy? And I'm thinking like in SAFe, there would be Scrum teams that roll into arts, that roll into solution trains. Does that same kind of hierarchy hold in Kanban?
Yes and no. I wouldn't consider it hierarchy, but I would consider it certainly the visualization to the left and to the right of the core execution. So the hierarchy in SAFe is something like coming from top down, and they do talk about Kanban there as well. The visualization that I have here with the flows is more just going left to right, that everybody has visibility into, or as much as possible. And the core executioners in the middle would be, let's say, your Scrum teams. So they wouldn't really touch what's further out to the left or further out to the right. And the decision makers might also be outside of the core executioners for the Scrum team. So there's a yes and no to this.
Okay, thanks.
And I also wanted to add about that question about, production support. Think about it. Like if you're a Scrum team, you're doing sprint planning and your job is to support production, how can you do sprint planning? Because you don't know what kind of tickets you're going to be getting as you're planning, because the tickets come in, they could come in a minute after you're done with planning, or they could come in next week. So there's definitely things you could, these are tools that we have in our toolbox, and we're hoping to give you the ideas and skills and say, wait a minute, well, maybe we should try Kanban for this, or something like that. And the power of Agile is you can start with Scrum, and if it doesn't work, go to Kanban, or you can do vice versa. And that's the power of it. You don't want to like switch frequently, but you're not like setting yourself in stone, like, oh, we're going to do Scrum and we're going to be stuck doing this for 3 years. And that's really the power of Agile.
Let me stay in production support, and I'll push on this just a little bit more, if that's okay.
Sure.
So we are in production support for wristwatches. And there's one leg of production support that handles cracked watch faces, another battery or power issues, another alignment, timing out of, inaccuracy issues. So each of those would have their own backlog, figure out, their whip, do the left to right thing. But I guess my question is, is there a roll up that says we have a master Kanban that says, here's all the watch problems, and then it decomposes into more granular Kanbans for each of those subgroups?
You could, this is just my opinion, because typically the organization would be looking for some metrics as such. So it depends on your tools as well and what allows for this. I'm thinking, themes to epics, to features, to stories, just as a
Right.
poor example, what we see that in tools like Jira, right? The
Mhm.
other thing is, if there's a way or a tool where you can get, let's say, the cycle time or throughput of one team, and then that gets into the type of work, such as a cracked screen, and then you can look at the throughput cycle time of another team to see what that looks like. So you may not necessarily need to visualize everything, but certainly you have those metrics and you can act upon it. So it's just the need of the organization. If the team is looking for that roll up, you certainly could. But again, I just caution you on the use of metrics and how they're going to be presented to people.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
And also, Larry, you could also think a lot of times people always equate one team to one project. And so like what you're describing is, it sounds like you have maybe 3 or 4 teams, and so if you follow that metaphor, you might have 3 or 4 projects. But if you might take a step back and think about putting all the work in the same project, and then using, like if you're using Jira, maybe using components to separate the different work, like you mentioned, the batteries, the watch faces, and things like that. And then that way it's all in one place and you have everything there. You don't have to go to 4 separate places, to get that information. And and what, in my experience, the more teams working in the same project, it makes it more agile, because it's a lot easier to share information and work back and forth. Just a thought. I'm not really sure how you're set up.
Now that actually, thank you, Bob. That's really helpful. So it's kind of just using the technology, Jira, which is what we use, by the way. So, okay, so that we can I could subset it within the tool.
Yeah, and you could create a board based on each component. And then basically each team would have their own board, and then you can have a board with everything. And then basically it's all together. It's very, very quick and very simple.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
All right,
Some
Nick,
of
do
the
you want to-
visionaries, yeah, just one last comment. Some of the visionaries with Scrum And even the Scrum guide said, hey, have one product backlog. Dump everything in that one place, that one bucket, and then figure out how do you want to view things? How do you want to slice and dice things, right? There's something to keep in mind there as well. All right, so let's move ahead. Limiting WIP. This seems fairly obvious, right? There's only so much you can consume. So what are your WIP limits, And just as Scrum teams experiment with velocity, which I say is just an outcome of something, that's a rolling average, WIP limits are also open to experimentation. This is particularly true when you have a newer team and you're like, okay, how much can we do? Well, we don't know till we start feeling the pressure or choking, right? So this number will evolve. And how might we use this on a Scrum team? Again, pull it up during your daily Scrum and say, hey, these are the things we're tackling on as of this moment, as of today. So, anywhere else we think we could use WIP limits? Open question.
Backlog refinement, prioritizing backlogs, things like that. It would be a contributing factor or an input.
Yep, agreed.
Yeah, one of the places that we try to use WIP limits and we struggle is when we're looking at the boards and we're trying to set up each of the workflow stages to have limits there, kind of step by step, but the team crosses roles. How might we work with that?
So I may not answer your question directly, but I'm going to bring about a scenario and I'm going to play devil's advocate. Let's say you're at a huddle or a daily Scrum and your team is working on something. Say, hey, we've reached our WIP limit. We said we could do, let's say, 7 items, but it seems we can take on more. We need to take on more, maybe 8 or 9. What should the Scrum team do or the members do in this scenario? So the question's back at you.
Yeah, well, and I think this is where my teams fall over. We have like 5 teams in the group that all operate independently on different vertical functions. What happens is they don't recognize those limits because people cross across the different phases of delivery, whether it's design or a development or a test function. As we're moving those through the board, what we struggle with is we might get a flag and saying we're over our limit in a given phase, but the team feels that overall, because we're under someplace else, we're okay. But I don't know that all limits are equal, right? So it kind of becomes a bit of a subjective measure at times. And that is where I'm struggling on how to better measure, right? When am I really over? Because maybe all columns are not equal, right? All levels of limit are not equal.
Of course, that's just the nature of the work and the multitude of teams. Here's something that I learned, and when I heard it, I almost fell off my chair. It's okay to break the WIP limit. And if you think about it, Scrum teams are empowered to be self-organizing. So it's certainly good to have a flag. Hey guys, we said we can do X amount of work, based on capacity, historical trends, maybe their timelines, time off, vacation, and whatnot. But the team can, at any junction, break a WIP limit, and that is acceptable in Kanban. What the team should certainly also do to supplement that is to kind of reflect and to see if any adjustments have to be made, right? Because WIP limits is just a rule, and like they say, traditionally, rules are meant to be broken. Right?
And is there a way to do that at an aggregate level across the board versus just at a column level on the board?
I would check with the teams and the nature of the work. So each swim lane could have its own WIP limit. Right. This is also assuming, you might have specialists along the way. So there might be certain types of work that, teams can blaze through very quickly, or to say, you can pile it on us, we'll keep going. We got it. Right. And then you might have another swim lane that says, whoa, 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 you got to slow down,
Right.
because there might be a higher risk, assumptions. People really need to take a close look at things, or dependencies or whatnot. And then you get into some exit agreements and criteria as well for that particular swim lane, right? So it all depends, and you got to just make sure everybody's aligned to those things.
Yeah, I hear you. I get in Jira, we use Jira as well. Is there a way to do an aggregate whip? Is that even technically possible?
I've used Rally. I haven't used Jira in a long time. I know there are Jira settings on that tool, but I can't recall if there's an aggregate or something like that.
I haven't seen that, but we're using not the latest version in Jira.
Okay.
I've said it does a great job at the column level. You get that column turning red, but it doesn't. I don't think it adds up. That's an interesting thing, because I'd like to maybe experiment and take a look at that.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
So limiting whip, certainly have a whip limit, talk it through, and let people break this as well. And that's okay, with some boundaries and reason as well. What else is there as a practice that we should be looking at?
I just have to share a funny story with you. When I launched my Kanban team, my whole board went red. I was like, man, I'm dead. But we survived, like what Nitin said, let the team decide, right? So, initially we were very conservative with the whips. And so when we got started, everything was turned red. I was like, oh no, but it works. You just have to work with the team and figure it out.
Yeah, well, and that's exactly why I was asking the question in a way, is that I too often, when I reach back into those different teams, nobody wants to say they're overloaded. We'll find a way to get it done. My bigger fear is that they then make mistakes because they're working too hard, or they're pressing too hard to make deadlines, and something else goes wrong and I'll pay for it on the back end, right, with some kind of a release issue.
It's
so that's why
quality.
I'm trying to find a way to catch it up front. Yeah.
Yeah. We'll get into cycle time very quickly. That could be helping you out ahead.
All right.
Paul Sayers has a question on the chat. He says, are there sprints in Kanban?
No sprints in Kanban. That's a Scrum concept. Again,
this is something we do, we call it a monthly stakeholder review, which is very similar to like a sprint review, but and then we follow that with a retrospective. So in essence, our team chose we're going to show our stakeholders every month what we delivered, and then basically during that meeting, just like a sprint review meeting, you say, okay, this is what we did for your area, this is what we did, and we let either the product owner or the developer talk about it. So yeah, there is not a sprint like Nitin said. And so this next page, you want me to take the first pass, Nitin? Active management of WIP.
Yep. So again, this is a pull system, like most agile practices. And when we have a WIP limit, we just can't just let it, oh yeah, we've got a WIP. No, we want to try to work with this as closely as possible. Let the team pull in work at about the same rate as it's being exited, right? So you're done with one thing, let's pull something in. And the assumption is you consume your work. The work item age is not high because you want to make sure that what you're delivering is of value, right? Instead of just putting something in a backlog or a swim lane and it's just sitting there, right? So if something's saying, hey, this has been sitting there for 90 days or 100 days, there's something unusual about that. Now, depending on where it is, that might be acceptable to an organization. But if it's in your core center of the executioners, as I say, that might be too long. And then if there is something that's aging unnaturally, maybe it's a possible impediment, you want to act as quickly as you can to reduce the cycle time for that. So again, general question, when can a Scrum team act on WIP considerations?
It feels like a trick question. Yeah, I'm
It is.
inclined to say anytime. I mean, that's again, it's a guide. It's not locked in stone. So if we look at it and make an intentional decision, then whenever we do, that's the right time because it is in flow. And so, we're always in this Kanban, assuming we're using the board. And
Yes.
was the question if you're strictly Scrum?
Yeah.
In which case it would be typically best practice to do it at the end of one sprint, at an iteration or at a backlog, review.
It's a trick question indeed, Larry, but you kind of got it. You can act on this at any time, and certainly whenever the team has a moment to breathe, they should kind of look back and discuss these things. If you're using this with Scrum, then Scrum definitely's got a retrospective. And that's when everybody huddles together and they can talk about all of this for sure. So let's see what's number 4.
Sure, and also to add to what Nitin said, there's nothing stopping you if you're a Kanban team to do a retrospective. That's really up to you and the team how you want to go approach it. Because to me, you want to have that team feedback to say, hey, what went wrong? What really messed us up last time? In my case, it would be the last month. Inspect and adapt, Nitin.
Inspect and adapt. We hear this so often. INA. So the team's definition of workflow. We've talked about the categories, the defining of the swim lanes, going beyond the traditional to do, in progress, and done. But we can also have further definition to when an item can come in. And then likewise, when is it ready to leave? In Scrum, we talk about definitions of ready, definitions of done. It's the same thing here. What's interesting is it can be per swim lane. So again, a bit of a trick question here. Can we have a ready and a done for a particular swim lane?
I guess the answer is if you want to put both statuses in the same swim lane.
You could.
I mean, not logical, but technically possible, I guess.
Something to think about. This was also very interesting to me when I was made aware of this concept. This kind of gets into the earlier narrative as well. When you have, let's say, a group or a team for a particular swim lane that can really take things very quickly, right? They'll probably get things in their swim lane and it might be marked ready. But then as they're working on it, you might just want another flag saying, okay, this is done, but it still sits in their swim lane. Now that's very interesting. People are trying to get rid of the work and move it on ahead. But if it is a pull system and it's going to the next swim lane, maybe they're not ready to pull it right away. But at least they've got some indicator of a done saying, okay, off the 20 or 15 or 10 or 7 things from the prior swim lane, I know these are the ones clearly marked that can be picked up, right? So it's very interesting to have this concept for each swim lane and see what teams members do with it. We might also see a group of specialists that might be having external dependencies, or if there's a lag, we'll see how it's piling up and saying, well, these are ready, but it's going to take some time, and we're going to get to it. When we're done, we'll move it to a done like state or have a flag or an indicator there.
You know, Nitin, as you were saying, I just thought of in a hospital, there's the emergency room, which has its WIP workflow, and then there's the fractures lane, which is if you come in with a broken bone, you go through a completely separate workflow. Still in the hospital, you still walked in the emergency room, but their definitions of ready, done, workflow, WIP, are very independent than if you come through the heart attack lane. So maybe
Correct.
that's an example.
Oh yeah, for sure. That's a great example too, right there. And it's interesting because in Kanban, you might say, or people might allude to, hey, you're a group of specialists. Are you really a team? Are you really being collaborative? Are you really being able to use any T-shaped skills? But in the example you used, people have to move fast and act quickly and share the information and make things visual, right? Before you move things ahead. So I'm digressing a little bit because people wonder, we want to have Scrum teams because it's more collaborative, people really huddle, but Kanban, are we getting into, just people are still in their silos? How is that going to look like? So it's very interesting, just the reflections. So if you have Kanban teams and you don't have a ready or a done for a particular swim lane, you might think about that. And some tools call it just exit criteria, and you might have it written up. But if you don't have anything like that, you might start wanting to think about that. Any thoughts, Bob?
Yeah, I agree. I've seen it with two columns next to each other. Like I'll see one column and then done next to it. I'll see the next column and done next to it to make it even more visual, because sometimes you're kind of stuck with the way the tool is, because to me, I think, that like right now using the tools I'm using, if I had done in 5 places, it would probably totally confuse the tool. And so, but it again, you don't want the tool to manage how you do your work. You just try to figure out how you want to do your work and then use the tool in the best way to kind of enable that. But it's a very interesting concept.
Are you using ready as a complete state or a start state?
If that question's to me, we have our items go into a backlog, and then we go through what you call a prioritization process, because we support multiple business areas. And then once we go through that process, the item will get set to ready. And then the team will then once it's in ready, the team's able to pull the items that are ready and start working on. That's how we manage it. We use if you're using Jira, you have that way of showing the backlog as a backlog. So you don't really clutter up your board with all the work that's not approved for the team to work on yet.
Okay, yep. No, I appreciate it. We do exactly the same. Yep, thanks.
All right, so let's see. So Nitin, what do you think about metrics?
Metrics, the age-old metrics, the dry behavior, So what does Kanban use? I picked up just a few things here. So throughput is just a count, what has reached an end state. And the one thing that I like about this is there's no argument about velocity or rolling averages or any kind of interpretations. In contrast, Scrum teams might say, hey, 10 user stories and spikes have been completed at the end of the sprint review that have met their definitions of done, certainly, and that's just it, 10 stories. So you can still use throughput as a metric with Scrum teams, And this is also very interesting because in Scrum, we say, hey, slice and dice your work into something thinner, into something smaller. If you're not using Scrum, your Kanban team members might say, well, but I think we can get more than 10 things out the door. Well, is there any way we can kind of wiggle around our nature of work, and what that looks like, how that's defined? So that's there. Some teams can do it and some teams can't. So it's just going to be, how do I go from 10 to 11? How do I go from 10 to 12, you know? But here's the other interesting thing. It's an outcome. And there's really, really no argument here. You know, hey, this is where we're at, given where we are at for this lane. So oversimplifying it, but any thoughts, Bob, or others?
And what we're using is basically, we're using how many, again, it's probably, it's not the best, but it's a, you know, your organization is always looking for numbers. And so what we do is each month we say, okay, we did this many for this customer, this many for this customer. And basically, you know, I'm sure people are looking at it like, oh, we did 10 for this area, 12 for this area. And that's part of it. And we also use the cumulative flow diagram to look at how long things take to go through our process as a way to see, to give our customers or stakeholders an idea, like when we pick up an item, about how long will it take to go through the flow. Now, on average, again, it could be sooner, it could be later, but you always have to be so careful about metrics, because teams get nervous because they think you know, they're going to be weaponized and they're going to be used to compare their, you know, one team versus another. And as Agilists, our job is to protect the team from that and just keep the metrics at what I would call just enough, so that the organization is happy, and then use your own team internal metrics to make your team improve. So, any other thoughts on that?
Open question. If not, we'll get into cycle time.
Okay, so for cycle time, I just brought that up. It's, you know, Jira's, you know, it's pretty cool. You go in there, there's a report, and you definitely can look at your average cycle time, and you choose your reporting period, and it says, okay, on average, it's taking the team to take, you know, say take 5 days, 10 days, 15 days, depending on the kind of work that you're doing. And that's something that the organization is looking at. They're, you know, they say, okay, a Kanban team should be continuously improving. So in essence, John, if you can mute that person, thank you. And so what the whole idea behind a Kanban team is, you know, as they get better at working and keeping in mind if the work stays the same, you can start anticipating, like, you know, if their cycle time was 10, maybe next month it might be 9 or 8 days. And, you know, it's just a way of looking at it, but don't get too hung up on it, because like the teams I'm working with now, our cycle time's way up there. Sometimes, you know, sometimes you'll see 20 days, sometimes you'll see 25 days, but then we take a step back and look at the work that we're doing, and it makes total sense. The work that we're doing is taking that long, and it's okay. So again, it's just a way of looking at how you're working, and a way to say, okay, you know, what can we change? What can we do a little bit differently? What's really slowing us down? And what we do is we'll invite members from other teams that are supporting us to be what we call like a flex member. And then they're able to reach out into their organizations, and they save that time where a developer doesn't need to figure out who to talk to. The person's there already. They say, I need help. And then the person that, you know, that's part of our meeting will say, okay, I'll get somebody to help. And then it's done. Like within 30 seconds, you already have the help that you need to get something done. So those are all things that, you know, we're using to look at to actually improve our cycle time. So Nitin, did you have any thoughts on that?
That was a great demonstration. The rate of speech that Bob spoke at was a very quick cycle time compared to the rate of speech and the use of words that I am taking out of my mouth, right? They're both words. It's the same English language, but people deliver things at different points of time, right? We're entertainers on the side, you know, show up for our evening gigs, folks. Great points, Bob. So one interesting thing I do want to bring about for cycle time, and hopefully this makes things a little easier for teams, because people are always trying to see how well they're doing, their group, their swim lane. You can have a cycle time from point A to right till the end, or maybe something in the middle. So that's something to think about, you know? So just again, scrummy example, it takes about 4 days from identifying work to have it ready to be picked up. That's different from when we identify the work to when it's delivered to when it has been picked up within a sprint to the sprint review, which is whatever is the end state defined, be it 1 week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, right? The other interesting thing is there's no argument about time. This really is an outcome based on days, typically in an organization, right? Again, there isn't anything on velocity or rolling averages and whatnot. So cycle time is usually something very easy to grasp and very easy to reflect with Kanban. So those are some of my thoughts in my slow speech.
Okay, and then now I'm looking at we have 9 minutes left. That's why I kind of went into a little speed, a little bit faster speed. So that's why. Okay. And so do you want to share some resources that you have?
Sure. So a lot of what I have explored, and this is just me, is some of the certifications that have come about more recently is through scrum.org. It's called Professional Scrum with Kanban. There is also a Kanban guide for Scrum teams. Certainly you can use Kanban independently, but if you really want to see the 4 practices and how it could weave in, you could read the guide, you could take a course. If there's a book you're interested in, some people like to read, Actionable Agile Metrics for Predictability by Dan McCanty, that's the one that I looked at. There are some other books by David Anderson, but I am a little bit more acquainted with this book and this work over here. So if anything stirred your interest and you want to explore more, be it training or certifications or guides, these are the 2 things.
So recently you got certified through scrum.org. Could you maybe share some of that experience with everyone if they're interested?
Oh, sure. You can, if you feel confident and comfortable that you know the concepts of Kanban, you can read their book, you can take an online assessment. You can read the guide, take the assessment, and sign up to do a certification. I was taken aback. I thought I could do it. I did not clear it. So I actually ended up taking a course and then found it very enlightening and insightful to the concepts. It was also very interesting to hear how people were doing it. It was a virtual offering. It might still be one over 2 days. There is the course fee for this. This is not with PMI. This is more with scrum.org, which is a certifying body that does the PSMs, Professional Scrum Master, Product Owner, and some other certifications out there in the industry. So this is well recognized and it is challenging. So I found it to be of great value. And surprisingly, just my first assignment, I was in the middle of the job market. I thought I'd get into a Scrum team and say, oh no, we've got a Kanban team for you. So very apt timing for me personally, and used a lot of what I had in the guide put to use right away.
Thanks for sharing that, man.
Gentlemen, there are 2 quick questions here in the chat. One from Thomas Sucha. Does Kanban start with what is considered done as with Scrum?
Does it start with or does it end with?
Well, that Tom, if you're on, you want to ask the question yourself to clarify. But Tom typed here in the chat. He said, "Oh, Tom, I see you turn on your microphone. Will you ask the question yourself?"
Yeah, I know that for in Scrum for the PBIs and things you have, and maybe the word's not done, but that you agree that you finish that one. So there's and I forgot the term.
Definition of done.
Thank you, definition of done. So I was wondering with Kanban, does it have the same thing? Because I know the one thing that I listened to tonight is that we talk about, well, you go to the end. Well, I know that with Scrum, it's a little different than that, because you're not going to go to the end. Things get broken down in a position where they go into those time boxes of a sprint, et cetera. So that's why I was wondering with Kanban, is there such a definition?
Oh, I don't think it's prescribed, but I think good practices have it. Like we have a definition of done. We also have for each column, we have exit criteria. So
Got it.
basically you can't exit a column until that is done. And in essence, it rolls into that overall definition of done. At least that's what we're doing. And Nate, I know you've been doing a lot more studying in Kanban. I don't know if that's actually prescribed or not.
So this is slide 13. If you go back, number 4, the INA, the team's definition of workflow.
Yeah.
So when we get into defining the swim lanes, we really get to start defining what comes in and what is the exit criteria. The exit
Okay.
criteria could be just, comparable to the definition of done.
Okay.
When we say, hey, when do we think this piece of work can move forward to the next swim lane? That's your exit criteria defined and your definition of done.
Got
So
it.
Kanban doesn't explicitly use the terminology, but does certainly say, hey, you got to define your workflows, and that's how it would be weaved in.
All right. Thank you, both of you. I just want to make sure.
All right. There's one more question from Conrad Wang, and I don't know, Conrad, if you want to get on and ask your question yourself. It says, can number be misleading? Oh, Conrad, I see you turned your microphone. Why don't you ask the question yourself to clarify?
Yes. So we're talking about the WIP limit, right? It's a number, right? But a lot of time, just like a support team, right? They handle the ticket, different
Yes.
support tasks, right? Take different time. So using just use a number to quantify something is good, but can it be misleading? Because sometimes you will achieve a lot of things during a period of time, but sometimes you achieve much less.
Yeah, so we got into a similar narrative earlier where is the WIP limit set in stone or can it be moved or is it flexible, right? Certainly there are different types of work. There's different severity of work or the intensity or the
Correct.
outcome, right? There could even be a dollar amount associated to this, if we crunch fees. But again, for one particular swim lane, how much work can be consumed over there? That's something the team has to look at together. And also, Kanban does allow you to break that limit. So certainly use the limit to recognize that there could be a compromise of quality, or there's so much based on history that this is a healthy limit and how much we can consume. But at the same time, yeah, if you have to break that limit, then break it,
I
there
just
will be
want
consequences and we talk about it.
I just wonder, right? Because in Scrum, right, we have a concept of story point. Can we
Yes.
modify it and use it here? In other words, when a task come in, right, I say that for big, right, it's a 10 point or whatever. So instead of number, right, we say how much point for any link that the team can.
Interesting. So
Nate,
you're
we might
getting
want to save
into
this for
definition of workflow. I'm
after
glad
the,
this question came about.
we have 2 minutes left. I'd like to formally end the meeting, but I think this would be a great discussion after the meeting ends.
We'll stay on.
If you're able to stay on.
Yeah,
But
so
I just
very-
want to just come into the home stretch here. Is that okay, Nitin?
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
All right, with that, I'd like to thank everyone for being here, and I will call this meeting to a close.